without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Brenda Allair. Brenda is a teacher of students with visual impairments at the Perkins School for the Blind. She's been there since 2009, and prior to Perkins, she worked at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. To kick the afternoon off, please welcome Ms. Brenda Allair to the podium.
So I wanted to present a little bit today about CVI in infants and toddlers. I work right now primarily with children birth to 3 and with teachers at Perkins who work with those children. And we see a lot of kids with CVI, and we also get them in their early phases of diagnosis. So I want to share some information about how we do that, how kids get referred to Perkins, and just a little bit about the prevalence of kids that we're seeing. So I know this morning there was a lot of conversation today about identifying kids with CVI and at risk for CVI. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate a little bit of that. So children who have conditions diagnosed that are associated with CVI, including things like seizure disorder, PBL, and associated white matter disorders, and also hypoxia. So we see a lot of those. When we come in, we start hearing about that from families, and kind of triggers us to think about CVI. We start off with families, we're sometimes the first line that families are seeing in terms of vision, and so we hear from them about visual behaviors that are characteristic of CVI. So for myself, I know when parents start saying things like, well, when she looks at me, she kind of looks right through me, or her favorite toy is Elmo and she doesn't want to look at anything else. Those are things that for me kind of raise a little bit of a flag. So we're talking about that when we first go in to see families, because the children aren't always diagnosed right away. So it gives us some sense of what to look for. And then children for whom there are concerns about vision impairment, that they've had either a normal or near normal eye exam, or maybe some of the associated ocular things that we were talking about earlier. That happens pretty frequently in early intervention. So when we get referrals, it's often the kids who have extra business, but the early intervention programs are concerned about the way the child's using their vision or not using it in appropriate settings. So those are where we're first introduced to the child, and then we kind of start building on that information. And I wanted to share a little bit here about CVI from the AFD conference that Terry Trojan shared with us at a recent meeting. And this was information about CVI nationwide that's been collected. So this is new data that's being shared. It's started in 2001, and so 2001, they had about 406 babies enrolled in the study, and by 2013 we had just shy of 6,000 babies that were enrolled. And so the information from that, based on all that data that they collected, and that was not all 50 states, but more states are continuing to share the babies count information, so more states are continuing to provide data around that. And overall, what they found is 65% of the babies that we're seeing have CVI. And that in 2013, that percent was 85%, and most of those children had additional disabilities. So we're seeing really complex kids with CVI, and some of that's why we're having trouble with diagnosis in certain areas of the country, because, as somebody said earlier, when we see these complex kids, their behaviors are also, often attributed to other things besides vision. So just to be cognizant of that, as we get our kids in early intervention, and as you guys start hearing from families early on. So a little bit about our services and how kids get into specialty services, which is part of early intervention, which Perkins provides. So if a child is diagnosed with CVI, as several of the speakers before me have said, then the early referral is really critical because we can make a difference for those kids. So if we get early referral, they get into early intervention, they get our services more quickly, and we can work on increasing their visual functioning, especially if they get ready for school, and we can talk about the kinds of interventions they're going to need when they get to school. We can sort of set the stage. We can connect families to local early intervention programs if they're not already. So we sometimes get referrals from families or doctors or other providers because they're concerned about a child's vision and don't necessarily realize that that's going to affect all their development, so they need to be enrolled in their own intervention program as well. So we make sure that that's going to happen too. So talking to all of you, I would say my big take-home message is going to be refer, refer, refer. If you have any question, if you see a family early on, if for some reason you're connected with a family that has expressed concerns in their child under 3, to refer to us. We can help with the process of referring for early intervention, but certainly it's better to refer and get that ball rolling than to wait. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about how that happens. So this is our referral process here, and in Massachusetts, we're the specialty service provider for kids with vision impairment, although some early intervention programs, I know Ellen works with some early intervention programs as well, but the process of getting kids into early intervention is about the same. So the first thing we want to talk about is making sure that the family knows that you're referring to Perkins. We like them to know that when we call and say Perkins, the Perkins School for the Blind, that the parents understand what it is that we're doing and why we're going to talk with them, especially for kids who are newly diagnosed or awaiting diagnosis. The terminology can be really intimidating. So we encourage the referring provider, whoever that might be, to make sure there's a conversation with the family around that. To have a copy of the I report, if it's available. I'm sure you all know how fun hunting those down can be. And especially, talking in this realm about CVI, we want the I report to give us the information that says, yes, there's this ocular issue, or no, there isn't. So that when we go in and there's concern about vision, we really have a sense of what's already been done and what kinds of things we want to look at. Could this be a result of the ocular issue, or am I really going to be thinking CVI when I go in? So that's really helpful. To gather information about the child, so things you probably would do anyways if you got a child on your caseload, but if this is a new child to you or some family that you're just talking with, you maybe met them somewhere and you're starting to talk about early intervention, the additional medical diagnoses they might have, again, so we can think about those red flag conditions, specific areas of concern, so that's that part of the conversation with the family. Are they giving you some of that language that you want to say, maybe this is something we should think about, and then, what are their concerns? What are the families expressing to you so that we can share that with our teachers and talk about that? And then if they're already in an EI program, we want that contact information. And there are the contact information there for our social workers who do the intake for our program. So I think those are in the handout as well. And if not, they'll obviously be on the slides when you guys pick them. So Ruth and Christina are our social workers, and they take care of gathering all that information, and then we share that with our teachers. So that's sort of the basic of how kids get to us, and what I really would like to share today is a case study for a child that I was lucky enough to work with, and I'm sure you can tell he's adorable. So this is a picture of a little boy that I was working with, and I have permission from mom to share information about him. So his name is Colin, and in this picture I think he's playing with one of his favorite toys. And so I worked with him, and he has an extensive team, an extensive history and diagnoses. So I want to share a little bit about that and talk about the ways we collaborated. So one of the things that's really important to me in early intervention, especially working with kids with CVI who tend to have additional disabilities that can be pretty significant, is how do we create a team of collaborators so that when those children transition out, and they all eventually will, to the school system, that we've built a way for those kids to understand, and a way for the families and providers to share with the school districts, and then with you guys, because that's probably the point where most of you are going to get them. So he was referred to Perkins a little bit before his first birthday for concerns about vision development, and it was sort of a general concern. Mom was a little bit concerned, his early intervention providers were concerned that his development didn't seem to match what they would have expected for his age, even given his other issues. He was, shortly after I started seeing him, diagnosed with a genetic condition that has a related seizure disorder, and he had, at the time he was on seizure medication, and had had multiple seizures at birth, and so was delayed significantly because of those, and his genetic condition is also associated with some other health needs. So mom and dad were very concerned that that was not at all explaining the behaviors that they were seeing. So, we did a lot of observation. I did a lot of conversation, as other people have said, around interviewing the family and talking with the providers and seeing what their concerns were about his vision. He gazed to an extreme degree when I first saw him, almost unable to be redirected. So that was sort of my first big flag, was he would lay on his back and stare out the window for 90% of the session. He really would only look towards something that was red, every once in a while very fleeting. And so those were things that other people were saying to me and that I was observing. So he didn't have a CVI diagnosis. Nobody was really talking about it, and we were really cautious. I'm obviously not a doctor, so I can't diagnose. What I did in that case was talk to the family and the providers and say, so children with particular kinds of diagnosis can often have issues relating to visual, the way that vision is processed in the brain, and would it be okay if, and I started doing the CVI range and shared what I was doing with them. So they understood what it was that I was looking for and why. And so we did that together, and I wrote up a report and brought that, shared it with the family, and they shared it with their neurologist and ophthalmologist, and he did get a CVI diagnosis from them. Alright, so this is another picture of my little friend. So this is Colin wearing his Batman t-shirt because we call him, he's a superhero. And he is, he's a hard worker, and his family's very, very dedicated and very big advocates for him. So, as you can see, because of his challenges and because his family advocated for his needs, he had a gigantic early intervention team. So he had OT, PT, a speech therapist, a developmental specialist from early intervention. He was, shortly after I saw him, diagnosed with autism, which is associated with his genetic condition. So he was diagnosed with autism and had autism specialists at his home 20 to 25 hours a week. He had myself, TBI. He attended 2 play groups, so those providers as well, those teachers. He had outside therapists for feeding and physical therapy, and of course he had his family, which included mom, dad, grandparents, their daycare providers, so a lot of very involved people who really wanted to do a good job for him. And I was one of those people, and I wanted to make sure things went well. It's a really big team, and in early intervention, as I'm sure you know with school teams, it can be really isolated. So people are working on specific tasks without necessarily collaborating on what's happening. And because of his vision needs, we all knew that that was going to impact all of his development. So we wanted to make sure that we created a team that met all of his needs, that I understood what they were working on, they understood the strategies they would need to help him be successful. So we came up with a team approach that was developed shortly after I started with him and right after his autism diagnosis, because the autism specialists came in and were feeling really overwhelmed by his vision needs, because they're used to seeing some kinds of visual behaviors, but they knew that his weren't based on his autism diagnosis. So we talked about using a strength-based approach, by which I mean we looked at Colin as a whole child and what was he doing well. And so in the beginning, it wasn't a lot that he had in terms of visual strengths, but we knew we could build on those. He had a lot of communication issues, but we wanted to look at what is he doing well. So he was very social with his family. He loved music. He worked hard in his sessions. So we looked at those things and started working from there. We all worked together to integrate our strategies across disciplines. So rather than working in isolation, we had good communication among all of us. And we talked a lot about saying we don't know. So I don't know, let me talk to the physical therapist. I don't know, let me talk to the occupational therapist. And we did. So it wasn't just us saying that, we actually did go back and have conversations. We tried a lot of risk-taking, which is something I think people are afraid to do in schools and in early intervention, is sort of looking at things outside the box. What might work? Maybe it won't, maybe it will, but let's try it. And we did that really systematically. So we set up an activity that we wanted him to try that we didn't know whether or not he could be successful. We all agreed to give it a certain amount of time. We took data around whether or not he was successful, and then moved from there whether he did well or not, and we sort of just re-looked at those things. especially for him and for all children with complex needs. We really recognize that one size wasn't going to fit all. So the thing I might do with a child who had only CVI, not that there's a lot of them, but if there was, isn't necessarily what I would do for him. And the same thing for the physical therapist. You know, she had specific things she wanted to work on, but she knew she needed to integrate these other things too. And we were very cognizant of respecting and modeling the rights and responsibilities of the parents, so making sure that they were not just receiving our services, but that they were an integral part of participating in those services. And this is sort of my passion, is in early intervention, eventually we leave. And so it's important to me that those parents don't feel like they fell off a cliff at the end of early intervention, and that we can support that transition to school, and that when we sort of send them off to you guys, and you guys get them, that parents feel like that's been a smooth process. So, you know, it's not always wildly successful, but that's my goal. So one of the really important things that we did as part of this collaboration process was creating collaboration meetings. So again, in early intervention, there's a lot of home visits where the physical therapist goes in or I go in, and it's hard for us to communicate with each other. There's issues around billing and things like that that we had to overcome, but we were all really dedicated to this model. This was an excellent team, and I hadn't worked with all but one of them before, so we were all kind of new to each other, and it was really interesting to see how we kind of started building as a team. So we held consistent meetings every 4 to 6 weeks at the home, and those of us who couldn't attend in person were either Skyped or conference called in. I attended several of those meetings from my car. I'm sure we all do. But it was a way for us to make sure that we were all getting the same information at the same time. So that was important. The parents were always at the center of those conversations. So every time we had this meeting, the parents went first. And so it was, what are you seeing him doing right now? What are you concerned about him doing? What do you want to see him be able to do in the next 6 weeks? So their needs and their interests were really driving those conversations. We came with our own ideas, but the whole, you know, the model was to be functional for the family and functional for Colin. So we wanted to make sure they were the center of that. And during those meetings, we did goal setting and evaluated the interventions we'd already done. So when the parents would express a concern around communication, we looked at what have we already done? Was it successful? Can we move to the next step? What do they want the next step to look like? And so we would set as a group a single goal. So we would talk about communication and set one goal for him, and I'll give you an example in a moment, that all of us would be working on through all of our sessions. So we might do it in different ways, and we might have a different protocol among us, but the goal was unified, so it was really important. We did a lot of troubleshooting, and in really positive ways. So things obviously were not always going to go well. You know, sometimes he had challenging behaviors, sometimes there were scheduling issues, and so we spent time deliberately at those meetings thinking about what might be an issue in the coming few weeks and how we could resolve it. So, you know, if there was a autism specialist that I hadn't had the chance to see yet, we would look at our schedules and make sure that I could come at that time. Or if somebody hadn't attended the last meeting and we wanted to catch them up. So a lot of things around making sure we were all on the same page and that we anticipated any problems that might happen. Again, we created a primary goal that was filtered through all of our own lenses, but with the end result being we wanted to be functional for Colin. And we created space for conversations and resource sharing. So some of this was around just being able to say, I have these ideas and what do you think? Without anybody feeling like they were being given a pop quiz on their specific discipline, because with a child who's very complex or has a diagnosis that's, you know, a little hard to understand. You know, some of the team hadn't ever worked with a child with CVI, so they were kind of still figuring out what that meant. We wanted to have conversations that were open and really honest, so people could ask questions without feeling like they were going to be judged. And we were very specific and clear that that was the model we were looking for, and it worked really well. So I think we all did feel like that we were being heard, and that the parents felt like they knew we were all working together, which was really important, so they could come to us with their concerns. So this is sort of an example of one of the things that we did. And And this was about implementing strategies across his services. So he had a goal, a communication goal, that he would choose from 2 pictures to indicate a preference. So Colin is nonverbal, but very curious and very active, and wanted to be able to make choices around the toys that he was playing with. His family wanted to be able to give him some freedom to do that. He was just starting to be a little bit mobile, but couldn't get himself over to where the toys were. So he was starting to have behaviors that were frustrating. You know, he would cry, he would get very upset because they couldn't figure out what he wanted. You know, similar to you see a lot of kids with communication issues. So we got together and we set this as our unifying goal during one of our meetings. We had tried a couple other things prior to this that had worked partially but weren't really functional for the family, and that Colin wasn't responding to as well as we had hoped. So we sat down and we decided to do this. And so I talked with Mom, who, again, wonderful advocate, very creative, always willing to try any new things that we kind of tossed at her. And we looked at designing pictures. So we wanted to be able to stop using real objects. And he had moved a little bit past that, but was still having some trouble. And he still had very significantly preferred objects, so we started with those. And we talked about using real pictures. He seemed to be responding well to that, so we chose those. But we had a black background for him. We made sure the size of the pictures was appropriate. You know, the contrast was appropriate. All those things that I was looking at from a vision perspective for him through that lens of CVI and what I know about that. And then he has positioning issues. So the OT shared her expertise around positioning so that he could use his motor skills appropriately for reaching towards those items, because if we wanted to look and reach, we need to set him up positionally to have success in that area. Otherwise, it wasn't really a functional skill. The PT wanted to provide support around increasing this tool while he was standing. So primarily he was in a sitting position, and he needed a lot of support to stand. So we looked at, can he use his vision well while he's standing? What kind of support does he need when he's doing that? And we had a trial and error session, but we were able to work through that too. And then the speech language person wanted to increase this over time to make it a more functional communication skill. So not at this particular time, but as we moved forward, we started to expand how many pictures he had and had constant conversation around that's too many, that's too few, what do we do next? But again, all of us having that same conversation. And then the autism specialists really wanted to use this as part of their ongoing work through the kind of intensive services that they were providing. So we used the same pictures consistently for several sessions so that he would get used to them. So, you know, we had some issues with latency, of course, and the visually guided reach, all of those things. So by using it through his intensive services, he was able to get really frequent exposure. And again, that was because we shared information. You know, they shared with me, I shared with them, and we kind of looked at that through everybody's lens. And he ended up being very successful, and this is a strategy he took with him to school. It was part of IEP when he left us, and he was doing really well with using it to make a much wider variety of choices. So he started with 2 pictures, has moved to, I think, 4 pictures, and some tangible symbols for things like songs and movement. So, you know, it took a little while to build those skills, but he was able to do that. And then this one I don't have pictures of, although I'm desperate to get my hands on this chart. I've asked Mom for it a few times and she's working on it. This is what we call the visual demands chart. And I know, Ellen, you were talking about this before. So this is really important idea that came from actually one of the ABA therapists, and we copied it and loved it, and it was wonderful. So one of the things we noticed, as with many kids, is that Colin's visual attention was really dependent on his position and his ability to be supported and his environment. So we started seeing that he wasn't doing well in certain areas. You know, if we faced him towards the light, he wasn't attending to anything. But if we put him in the other quieter room, he could do more gross motor things and visually attend to the choice we wanted him to roll towards. So we had a chart, very detailed. The ABA therapist was wonderful about this. A very detailed chart that said when he's positioned in this way, so seated at his desk or in his stander, these are the level of visual demands we can expect of him. So his stander was really challenging for him physically. very limited visual demands on him. It was only a preferred toy in his favorite color in a quiet setting so that he could really be successful. But when he was sitting on the floor in a comfortable spot with mom, he could have much higher visual demands. And so that was incorporated into his programming across the board. And we would co-visit pretty often, so I would see with the speech therapist and the other therapist so that we could see what we were doing and what that chart meant. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was something that we were really putting into action all the time. And then Colin had to get ready to leave. So it was very sad, actually. We'd all been working with him for a while. We wanted him to be really successful in school. So again, we started making sure that those team meetings now were structured around transition, that he was connected with Mass Commission, and his worker from the commission was beginning to be really involved in those meetings, calling in, checking in, really helping the family be in contact with the school so that the school was starting to be involved in those as well. And we did that pretty early on. Mom developed an All About Me document to share with the school, and in the same model that we had been doing, it was routine-based, parent-driven. The team had input around the strategies and skill areas that we knew he was doing well in and wanted to continue working on. We talked a lot with the parents about generating questions and concerns about transition, and like most families, they had a lot of them. Specifically, the school district they were going into was having a change in administration, so there were some issues going on there. The staff and district were not uncomfortable but unsure about having a child with vision impairment in their classroom, knew little to nothing about CVI, and not a whole lot about kids with complex needs either. So it was a difficult time for everybody in terms of feeling comfortable about what was going to happen for him. So there was a lot of discussion, which is why we talked about transition early and often. And I do this with most of my families, but specifically with those complex kids, to reiterate that transition is an ongoing process and not a point in time. And I'm sure you guys do that with your kids sort of across the spectrum of ages. But when we have the little ones, it tends to be a little bit more of an emotional piece for families. So we have to talk about that pretty often. So I talked a little bit about the role that you guys can play in smoothing the transition and being involved with families. I consider the commission a key player for transition to school services because there are districts that haven't had a lot of experience, because you guys are going to be the ones to carry them through. So the more you know, the better, and that we can get that information to the families faster as well. So early and ongoing connection with the family and the CVI is really helpful, and to support the school in understanding the impact of CVI. So Colin's worker was at all of his meetings, and he had several before he started school, and she was able to really explain along with me what the impact was, and to really talk about the need for services and the need for collaboration, which was really helpful in getting them on board. To connect families with additional resources and other families. So once they leave us, we share resources in early intervention, but there's additional resources after they turn 3 that you guys would be more aware of and be able to share with them. And the sooner we do that for families, the more comfortable they feel about leaving early intervention, because they know that there's sort of a world out there that's still going to support them. To provide tools and information for advocacy. So you guys see the school districts, you know what's going on out there. And you can help in terms of giving parents those sort of tips and tricks around advocacy. And we do that in early intervention. We have supports around that, but they're going to need those skills long term. So we have them for 3 years if we're lucky, usually a little bit less. And then they go to school and they're there for a lot longer. So families really need to know how to advocate and feel comfortable with that. Information about eye appointments and the importance of eye reports and access to medical information. It can be easy for complex kids that kind of gets lost in the shuffle. There's a lot of medical appointments, there's a lot of things going on. So when they're connected to MCV, I feel like they sort of have at the forefront the importance of ongoing medical appointments with their eye professional to gather that information. So I think that's a really important piece. And then to help families with the ongoing needs for support beyond early intervention. And then these are just some next steps that I have. These are resources that you might already have access to, but I just want to reiterate them. Mass Family Ties is the repositor for the early intervention programs online. They have all the early intervention programs listed by name and that the link is in this slide. The referral information for infant toddlers here. Wonder Baby is a great resource for families of young children, even beyond early intervention, especially for kids with multiple disabilities. And the APH CVI website is sort of new and up and running, so it's a good resource. Yeah.
I was just wondering, when Colin made the transition to the school, did you approach the school as a team? And I'm wondering how that was received.
So the question is, when Colin transitioned to school, did we approach them as a team, and how was that received? So the easy answer is yes. The more complicated answer is we all went to the meeting as a unified team. We had already had connections with some of the team members at the school, so the speech therapist had been out to visit Colin and knew what kind of the model that we were using. The physical therapist was going to be the same one that was in early intervention, so she had a connection already to the school. The initial meetings were really interesting in terms of they kind of had a sense of the programming they wanted for him when they were thinking of him through the lens of autism. So that they understood. They had a program geared for that. They felt like that was going to be a good fit. And as soon as we said, but he has a vision impairment, they sort of went, I have no idea what that means. And so there was a lot of conversation about how does this vision impairment impact all of these pieces. So the original team that we met with, they were nervous but receptive, and I spent a lot of time with the classroom teacher. I went to what was his anticipated classroom, which was a visual disaster. Gigantic, like windows like this with no covering, the most complex rug I've ever seen, like patterned wallpaper on the toy shelf. It really, my eyes hurt, and I don't have vision impairment, so I knew it was not a good fit for him at all. There was even like reflective tile on the floor. It was just, think of the worst CVI environment you can, and that's what it was. So we had a lot of conversation about this isn't going to work for him. Let's go to the classroom next door that's dimmer and has a nice quiet space, and there's a dark rug on the floor. Like, they understood what I was saying, and so the initial piece was going well. They were hearing us. There was a change in administration shortly after our original really successful meetings, and the new administration not only was less receptive, but really didn't buy that Colin had a vision impairment. So they were not really interested in getting him out of the classroom that was really inappropriate for him. And I have spoken with Mom frequently, and they had a lot of need for advocacy. So the good news is the Mass Commission person who was working with the family was extraordinarily helpful in helping them advocate, gave them resources, really kind of kept going back to the school saying, this is really what he needs. The TBI that's working with him is very experienced and knowledgeable, and kept reiterating the same things. So I found out very recently that he is not only getting all of these compensatory services that he needs, but the school has been much more responsive in the last few months now that they sort of are all back on board. But there was a significant problem when there was a change in administration, because the understanding that we had built originally kind of fell apart, because that team had kind of come to understand Colin and his needs, and the new team, again, they sort of didn't buy CVI. So that was interesting. That was interesting for me. Yeah.
Well, when you do, and kind of on the same question, when you do your evaluations and your transition, at that point, doesn't the IEP have to start their own assessments and also have all the stuff related to vision done at the same time, and that doesn't always happen?
Right. So the question is around when we transition children from early intervention to preschool or preschool setting, don't they have to do their own assessments, and shouldn't vision be part of that? This district didn't have and had never had a TBI, so at the time of transition, they didn't really even know what a TBI was or what they would do. So they accepted my report, the early intervention report, and some districts will do that if they don't have a TBI. And I had done the CVI range for him. We had a really thorough functional vision for him. So they accepted that information, and they used it to help write his IEP. So his original IEP was really good. It was the implementation of it that became a problem. So we had accommodations in there around the lighting. We had information about his classroom setting.
So some do an arena evaluation, which is devastating for
Yeah.
CVI, because you're talking about it, it's typically taking place at the school setting, not in the home, so it's an unfamiliar environment. There's multiple people interacting with the child at once, which is an overwhelming, overstimulating, and somewhat inappropriate if they don't understand the child and the needs of that child in regards to an assessment. And then some school districts will say, well, we'll just take the reports and they'll co-treat the school district therapist with the early intervention therapist in the home setting, which is a much better assessment of where the child is. So there's no consistency anywhere. It's pockets of, and each district does it differently. And the results vary, and the acceptance of the IFSP and the existing goals from early intervention are interpreted very differently across settings.
Yeah, the original team, they were very nervous about having him come to the classroom, and they expressed that to me pretty frequently. But they were also really asking for training. So probably at the end of the summer, I went in and did a little bit of training around setting up the classroom, and we talked about that. And then his new CVI came in, and I know her well, so we had collaborated on some information as well. So the ducks were in a row, but nobody wanted to put them in the pool. It happened eventually, and it happened because there was a lot of good advocacy for him. And I'd like to think because the family had information. So as an early intervention team, we gave them the pieces that they needed. Mom and dad understood what CVI was, the other therapists understood what it was and how it was going to impact his functioning in the classroom. And I think that it made it easier for them to advocate, and having Mass Commission involved did too.
If the parents hadn't been so proactive at a young age to get that diagnosis, would they have just assumed that a lot of his symptoms were from the autism, and when would they have picked up on that?
So I think there was a lot of concern about the autism initially, and the parents they weren't really concerned about that what they thought was that the business really explained all of his vision functioning. So they were worried about it, but they didn't understand that there could be something else happening. So when I went in and was able to say, geez, there's this set of characteristics and maybe we should talk about that, they were absolutely open to hearing that, but it was a way of having a conversation. And then because he had all those characteristics and some other behaviors that were not explained by that, then they had him evaluated for autism as well. So I know there's a lot of discussion about whether kids with autism really have CVI and it's undiagnosed. His genetic condition was associated with autism, so it was easier for him to kind of get that evaluation moving forward. And a lot of his behaviors were not explained by CVI, so there were some specific things that did not fall under the realm of CVI characteristics. And so we were able to kind of tease those out a little bit, again, with that nice collaboration model. Yes?
If you start, I'd like to hear an ideal scenario of collaboration and coordination between the Commission for the Blind, Child Find, Early Intervention, locally supported IDEA programs. So if you began in a NICU, intensive care unit, what would the ideal process be?
So that's a great question. So the question is, what's the ideal process? If somebody wants to come up with one, that's great. But an ideal process that would include all of the agencies and support people that would be with this child for, birth to school age, I would say. And so around maybe in the NICU. And so I would say it depends on where that person comes in. So we get families, as I'm sure you guys do, at all different phases. Some of our kids come in very early, right out of the NICU, and some of them I just got a child who turned 3 2 weeks after I saw him. So I really didn't get a chance to do a whole lot with him except provide information. But ideally, the child gets into early intervention through a referral from a pediatrician or a family or somebody who's knowledgeable about how that referral happens. If it's a child with a vision impairment, in my ideal world, they'd be connected with Perkins, TBI, or the TBI support, and Mass Commission at the same time.
Would mandatory reporting, like state law on vision impairment, would that necessarily come to the Commission?
No, and I think part of the issue is that, especially around CVI, the diagnosis, and a lot of people have been talking about it, it's not an easy diagnosis, it's not something that they can go to the eye doctor and the eye doctor says, yep, that's definitely what it is, here's your registration. So I think there's a lot of issues around that, I think I'm hoping that some of what comes out of this is
How does
that.
establish, the vagaries around established risk, how does that interfere with the appropriate early diagnosis? There's this tendency to try to avoid labeling and diagnostic overshadowing and putting kids into a categorical program too early. And so you have this language around risk. Does that get in the way of early identification from your perspective?
So the question is, are the at-risk things that we've been talking about interfering with? So Ellen, it looks like you have.
I want to say there's a research study happening right now with babies in the NICU using reaction to light as a screening tool, specifically to red light that's going on right now, and that will be horrific once they get some numbers back from that, and it's looking very good right now. So to be able to pick these kids up that are clearly at risk from their medical diagnoses, that to be able to say, let's raise the flag here for CVI. So that will be, in the NICU, huge.
And I think there's a lot of information and work being done around education for ophthalmologists, optometrists, and other professionals in the field around learning what those risks are and why we're looking at them.
The testability of a child is also a huge factor, because if you have other children and you take your child to an ophthalmologist that you've taken your other children to, they're not going to have the ability to test the way a person with specialized training would be able to test. And oftentimes, in my experiences, I've found that eye doctors will assume that the child is unable to be tested appropriately, not that they have a vision impairment, when it might be both.
I've also had a very recent experience with an eye doctor who I saw a child that I just got very recently in early intervention, has a lot of red flags for CVI, and my initial impression was really concerned. And so he went to the eye doctor, he had already had an appointment scheduled, went, and the doctor said, so he has a strabismus and his brain doesn't seem to be processing visual information very well, and refused to write down CVI. So I thought, so somebody needs some education. But I think that might happen more than we suspect, that the information is being given, but the diagnosis isn't being given. And so then I have an eye report that doesn't say that. And so it doesn't get documented somewhere.
If this child didn't carry a diagnosis of autism, what would it have been like to get the services?
For this child?
Yeah, this particular child. How much was that a driver in terms of getting the upswell of interest needed?
I think it kind of went both ways, actually, because his autism diagnosis was something they could latch onto for a specific set of services.
Exactly.
But the vision was something they were more concerned about in terms of, we clearly don't know what we're doing here.
Okay.
So I think in this particular district, if he hadn't had the autism, it would have still been a driving factor.
Okay.
I think the autism, he's just distracted a little bit from the setting that we wanted to look at,
Right.
but not in terms of, yes, he needs services. So they were really understanding that he needed services. It was what those were going to look like that was a little trickier. I mean, we're headed towards time, so I don't want to be close.
Paul,
Okay.
So I've been meaning to ask this question of other speakers as well. I'm trying to understand the relationship between CVI and other disabilities. And you made a statement that it's a rare or maybe never a CVI case that doesn't have other issues. So Colin, as an example, I assume was premature, but he had another genetic condition that correlated with autism. Generalizing is dangerous, but can you talk, based upon your experience with CVI, EI, how multi-disabilities sort of play into CVI?
my personal experience has been that I would say the vast majority, maybe even all, honestly, of the kids that I've seen with CVI have some additional disability. And Colin was not premature, but he had seizures at birth. So he was full term, but had a medical condition that presented immediately, and then his genetic condition was diagnosed as a result of that. And so he does have speech issues, he has gross and fine motor issues, all as a result of that underlying condition. Most of the kids that I've seen, partially because the conditions that are associated with CVI, so hypoxia, PBL, tend to have associated conditions. I'm sorry?
What is PBL?
PBL, periventricular leukomalacia.
I don't know what that means.
It's a disorder of the white matter in the brain. Ellen, chime in. That's my quick and dirty explanation. Help, not a doctor. So because of those conditions that are associated with CVI, they tend to have their own sets of needs or disabilities, and then CVI is also just another component of those. I do have a child now who has suspected CVI, suspected because he has not yet been diagnosed, who is, he's up and walking, he has a severe speech delay, a couple of other, motor skill delays, but looks pretty typical otherwise. But we just recently found out he had a uterine stroke, so he has some associated conditions from that.
So fast forward on Colin, now he's 22. Hopefully, due to your great work early on, the visual issues aren't anywhere near as significant. With the EI team that he has dealing with his other issues, do you feel that someone like Colin could ultimately be employed?
He's, what, 4 now, I think? And when he's 22, I will be crying because I can't believe that. But I think, he's made tremendous progress, and I think he's made progress because of a team like this. So somebody had asked about sort of the ideal world. In an ideal world, we'd be able to provide those kinds of services, and Colin would be somebody who I could see out in the workforce doing work that's appropriate to his level of need, but with appropriate supports. I think that's the model that I would love to see for every child. That's my ideal.
I think the definition of employment is important because, to me, employment with supports is employment because it's contributing in your own way at your level. It depends on what you define employment as. So,
Or the funding source.
right. Because there are going to be people who, no matter what, will not be able to independently go to work and come home. But to me, that isn't what employment is. So.
Yeah, and I know I'm gonna get hooked in about 3 seconds. And employment is beyond the scope of early intervention. But I think, my take home here would be that the model that we used here, the collaborative model, can be a model for any program. So within the commission, you're already collaborating with teams in school, and when they hit that transition age and you're talking about goals for independent living and employment, then that's the discussion you want to have around collaborating with not just the school, not just MCD, but the agencies that are also available sort of post-grad or post-secondary for those children. And this kind of model that allows for that to be happening across the spectrum rather than just at points in time when we say transition age. So, okay. Thank you.